Well, good morning or afternoon or evening. So we are now going to embark on workshopping the dialogue Euthyphro. Now, and so this is going to be part one. I am assuming that you've read it. If you haven't read it, go ahead and stop listening and read the full dialogue. What we're going to do now is we're going to I'm going to go through, jumping through certain areas in order to kind of analyze the plot and the meaning all at once. So we're going to workshop this together. But before we get to the actual dialogue, and in fact, here, if I'm using this Tufts edition, and there's the URL. So the dialogue begins when Euthyphro says, "What a strange thing has happened, Socrates, that you have left your accustomed haunts in the Lyceum and are now haunting the portico where the king Archon sits, for it cannot be that you have an action before the king as I have." Let's go ahead and explain that a little bit. Greek democracy centered around this, the ecclesia, which is where we get, if you're Christian, ecclesiastical and all that kind of stuff. It simply means assembly in Greek. And so this was all citizens, male citizens, were automatically in the ecclesia. From the ecclesia is where they, M for magistrate, I'll go Maj for magistrates, where they would elect magistrates, whatever officials were needed. There was something called the boule, which was sort of like an assembly maybe, that kind of dictated what these guys would do. And then there were the courts that all came out of here too. And there were several types of courts. The one that we're going to be looking at, Dikesia or whatever, could have up to 6,000 jurors. Okay? And that's where I want to, and there are two other ones, that high and Leia or something. It doesn't matter for our purposes. But here's the thing. So, in the United States, we have a Congress, right? And we elect representatives. In a direct democracy, you don't have representatives, you go yourself. And so at the ecclesia would be all the citizens. The population of Athens at its height, I think, if I recall, was like 300,000 or something like that. So, not the hugest city, but still, it would be quite cumbersome, even in Athens, to have all the male citizens sitting at the ecclesia. And indeed, they wouldn't all sit there all the time. But for the courts, the deal is the jurors and the archons, and an archon is, okay, here's where it gets weird. Of the magistrates, sorry, I don't mean to confuse you. There were two archons, A for archon. And the archons were chosen based on, they're elected from the ecclesia, and there's certain qualifications in order to be accepted. And archon simply means ruler. So in what we just read, the translator said king, not quite. And an archon could be elected for a trial as well. But here's the deal. The archons were elected at random. And so all the pieces of little pottery shards, you'd write the name on, and then you pull one out, and then it was actually a double random. And then from those, there'd be a second one, a second random based on whatever. It was really complex to make sure that things were very random. And also the jurors would simply be citizens from the ecclesia. And so the point of all this is to explain that this trial is nothing like an American-style trial. What's going on is you have two people who are contesting something in front of 6,000 people, and the way that the trials were decided, not by rule of law. So there's no codes written down, there's no lawyers, and the archons are not necessarily legal experts either. They're just dudes chosen at random. And so the way you win your case is purely democracy. It's 51%. There's a show of hands at the end, and whoever has 51% is right. Now, just because you have 51% of people doesn't mean that you have a just case, right? What it means is you were able to persuade 51%. How you do that? You could bribe the jury, you could scare the jury, you could entertain the jury, whatever is the case. So keep that in mind, because as we begin here, the dialogue, we get a couple of interesting things. So first of all, Socrates usually hangs out at the Lyceum, as we see here. And the Lyceum in Athens, or outside of Athens, was a temple to Apollo. And at the Lyceum, not only was there religious stuff, but they also tended to be sort of almost like a community center. There were classes given, like they would do military training, basic education. And so Socrates would hang out there because wherever there was some sort of education, that's where Socrates was. So it's interesting. Socrates, he says, now you're haunting the portico where the king Archon sits. In other words, Socrates has moved from the world of, education and thinking, and now he's in the world of politics. Okay, and so he says, well, I'm here for an indictment. Socrates, our Athenians, Euthyphro, call it an indictment. What? Someone has brought an indictment against you? Certainly not, blah, blah, blah. The guy's name is Miletus. Again, I'm going really fast because I'm assuming that you've read this. And I'm going to pause where we should stop and analyze things a little bit. Okay, has he brought a charge against you? And Socrates says, so Socrates is being sued by a kid named Miletus. And Euthyphro says, what sort of indictment? Here's Socrates' response. What source? No mean one, it seems, for me. For the fact that, young as he is, he has apprehended so important a matter reflects no small credit upon him. For he says he knows how the youth are corrupted, and who those are who corrupt them. He must be a wise man who, seeing my lack of wisdom, and that I am corrupting his fellows, comes to the state as a boy runs to his mother to accuse me. And he seems to me to be the only one of our public men who begins the right way. For the right way is to take care of the young men first, to make them as good as possible, just as a good husbandman, farmer, will naturally take care of the young plants first, and afterwards the rest. Okay, so we get a little insight into why Socrates is there, because he's being charged by Miletus for corrupting the youth. And this is an historical thing. There are records. And so notice as we start the Euthyphro, we're talking about Socrates' thing here. Now, if they're at the king Archon's court, then obviously they're both there for some legal issue. We now understand Socrates's, and we need to move to Euthyphro's case. And we talk a little bit more about these things. What I want to focus on is this. Okay, so Euthyphro was saying, goodness, how are you going to defend yourself? When I go to court, he says, they laugh at me. All right? And Socrates' response is telling here at 3D. Socrates says, well, Euthyphro asks him, I don't much desire to test their sentiments toward me in this matter. Socrates says, no, for perhaps they think that you are reserved and unwilling to impart your wisdom. But I fear that because of my love of men, they think that I not only pour myself out copiously to anyone and everyone without payment, but that I would even pay something myself if anyone would listen to me. Now if, as I was saying just now, they were to laugh at me as you say they do, it would not be bad, or it would not be at all unpleasant. Okay, what he's talking about is a difference. Okay, so I think we mentioned that philosopher in Greek means lover of wisdom, right? Philosophia, do you remember that? So Sophia is the Greek word for wisdom. Okay, so there's the philosopher, and the sophist. And these are both words. We also get the word sophisticated in English from this. But notice a philosopher is one who loves wisdom, whereas a sophist is saying basically a wise man. By the way, we're going to be sexist in here and not gender inclusive because that's the way the texts are. That's the way how many languages have masculine, feminine, neuter, and all that kind of stuff. So I apologize. It's not me that's being insensitive, but just we're gonna roll with the texts. And that's why when he says your love of men, he didn't mean anything about sexual orientation. He meant men in terms of mankind, including women as well. But anyways, so a philosopher is an amateur. Okay, now I think we might today think of amateur as like some kind of like, not as good, right? Etymology, sorry. But the word amat comes from the Latin amare, which means to love. So amateur literally means lover. So a philosopher is someone who loves wisdom. A wise man, however, is someone who, so if the amateur loves wisdom, the difference is that the sophist, who is a professional, these were guys, sophists, were guys who made their living giving public lectures. And these guys are paid. And therefore they possess wisdom. And there's a big difference here that I want to tease out. And it lies in this. So possession versus loving. In other words, these guys are always chasing wisdom, right? And so therefore Socrates is forever asking questions because he wants to know. These guys down here are experts. And they have reputations to uphold. Because since they are held to be experts and they get paid, their reputation as an expert is how they get paid. Therefore, the possessors of wisdom, there's a certain sort of arrogance and narrow-mindedness that goes in this. Because think about it, if you're taking, a class at a college and the professor's like, well, I don't know if I believe in the stuff I'm teaching because I really want to know for sure and I love questioning and I love wisdom. Well, then you're not going to want to pay that guy. Because when we go to college, we want to pay somebody who's going to give us something we need to exchange in a marketplace. And what we don't want in a marketplace is questions, right? What we want is expertise. Okay, so what Socrates was just saying about, I pour out my wisdom to anyone who will listen and don't pay a fee. What he's saying is, I'm not a sophist, right? So don't get mad at me, because, and people, I talk, but then they get mad at me, but it's like, I'm not even getting paid. It's not my job. I'm just a guy who loves wisdom. So if you want to listen to me, rock on, but then don't take me to court just because you listen to me. That's what he's getting at in that one. And then as we continue on, where I want to get to is Euthyphro's lawsuit. So here now, Euthyphro, we start talking about, why are you here? What's your case, Euthyphro? I'm prosecuting who? A man, blah, 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 for flying. Who is it? My father. So Euthyphro is suing his father, which in ancient Greek society would be a big deal. Like, you don't go against your family. Your father, my dear man? Certainly. What is the charge? What is the suit about? Murder, Socrates. Heracles. Surely, Euthyphro, most people do not know where the right lies. For I fancy it's not everyone who can rightly do what you are doing. What Socrates is saying is, if you're suing your father, boy, you better be really wise and just, because to sue your own father is going to be a very tricky thing. And to this, Euthyphro's response is, very far indeed, Socrates, by Zeus. In other words, he's saying, yes, Socrates, I am super wise.